Hi, and welcome to this edition of Incite Your Month. I choose to think we kick off each month with a short collection of ideas and recommendations from our recent curiosity diet. I have Harish with me here today. Hi, Harish.
Hey, hi Ramanand.
All right, Harish. So let's kickstart with a book recommendation. This comes from our friend Dharmendra, who's been gushing about this book by Margaret F. Vernon. It's called Beyond Measure: The Big Impact of Small Changes. And it's been described as a great manifesto for both CEOs as well as for employees. So one interesting thing that he pointed out to us when recommending the book was that when you're hiring people or in your team, you need to have people who act as windows to the world. And you don't want to end up hiring mirrors who simply echo what you are thinking. So I thought it was a very powerful sort of a statement.
Yeah, in fact, I think Mahatma Gandhi also said something on these lines where different cultures are how India as a country has evolved. And I think this is on the same lines where you want more diversity. You don't want to live in an echo chamber. You don't want to live in the Enter the Dragon room that Bruce Lee fights in, right?
Yeah. So from that recommendation, let's move to our monthly Blinkist summary of the month. We read one book summary every day. So what did we like from last month?
This one was very interesting. This is a book called The Lonely Century by Noreena Hertz. And it talks about how loneliness can actually lead to disease. We think this is not that impactful, but apparently it is. It can have very bad impacts on health of people. And the book also talks about the importance of micro interactions, something which a lot of people seem to have been missing in the last 1.5 years post pandemic. So it also reminded me of Dr. Atul Gawande's book Being Mortal, where he talks about people in palliative care, how when they are actually gardening, that has a great impact on their general health and how cheerful they are. So just having something to look forward to, and these interactions are a great way. And in fact, the book talks about how social robots can actually be a remedy to this kind of loneliness. So we have a cleaning robot at our place, and we've seen each other start talking to that robot from time to time. So I guess those days are not too far when these robots are going to solve the loneliness problem for people.
In fact, since we have been working with a lot of companies on engagement and culture, especially in a remote setting, everyone is on these channels, Slack channels, Teams channels. And I often find that not enough people are doing those micro interactions. And in this situation, it could be as simple as a little like, a little emoji, a little, this is interesting. There is a lot of overload, yes, but these little indications that you're not alone and what you have said has been received and appreciated, I think is something that a lot of people should definitely do.
Yeah.
So with that, let's go to our article of the month. I think it ties in nicely with the loneliness epidemic, because sometimes it can also feel like we are in a huge crowd and people are judging us all the time. Earlier, when we were in a pre-internet sort of an era, you had to worry about what your neighbors would say, what your family members would say. But now you have the whole world judging you, and maybe when they discover extraterrestrials, then it will be even worse. So this article is by Michael Gervais. He talks about how to stop worrying about what other people think of you. And we've also noticed this when we talked about social capital with a lot of companies and people. Like, on one hand, people are worried that no one is reading what they post. On the other hand, they're worried about being judged. So there is a very interesting contradiction there. And he introduces this phrase called FOPO, fear of people's opinion. Like, don't obsess about what people think about you. It will prevent you from being that. So have you been suffering from any FOPO, or is it something that doesn't affect you?
Yeah, so the internal censor board is always on, right? I think it is worse than the censor board in India. It's always trying to not just give a rating, but also use the scissors and cut different parts of my life. So it's always an effort to actually silence that censor board and say that, no, I just want to be myself. So yeah, I could, when I read that article, I could very easily identify myself with what he's talking about. And yes, it takes effort, but you have to do it. You have to be you, as he says.
Yeah, and the article also talks about something called the personal philosophy, a short phrase, which I
Right.
think will encourage all listeners and readers and viewers to go check out the article. And maybe next time we'll talk about what people's personal philosophy phrase is.
Right.
So from this, let's go to our audio video recommendations for this month. So tell me about the Smartcast and also the podcast of the month.
So the Smartcast is actually a good segue from what we just discussed earlier about having a personal philosophy. So this Smartcast that we're going to share is a Smartcast with Monish Darda, who is the CTO and co-founder of ICERTIS. They provide contract intelligence software to enterprise companies. It's a unicorn company. Monish gave me a lot of insights, lessons from the world of gaming, from other worlds, how he applies those lessons to his life as a CTO and a co-founder. The most interesting thing for me was Monish and Samir Bodas, his other co-founder at ICERTIS, they actually got together and agreed upon the kind of organization they want to build before they even figured out what product they wanted to build. So that was a great insight for me. He also said that this was wisdom that came in after being a fourth or fifth time entrepreneur. Yeah, if there are any founders, first time founders who are trying to feel their way into building organizations, take Monish's word for it and think about the culture and think about the organization you want to build first. So like we talked about the personal philosophy, I think it's very important to build or know what kind of organization you want to build. This Smartcast with Monish is our recommendation for the month.
All right. And what about the podcast episode for the month?
Oh yeah, so the podcast is an interesting one. It is what, a double, triple recommendation in my mind. So if you remember, we had talked about Vinita Gera's Smartcast as a recommendation. So in that Smartcast, she had spoken about Brené Brown and how she loves her work. So I also wanted to check out her podcast. And I checked out her podcast, and it's called Unlocking Us. So that's the first of the nested recommendations that we are talking about. The next part was Brené Brown talks about, she spoke to the creators of Ted Lasso, that is Jason Sudeikis and Brendan Hunt. I had heard of this show on Apple Plus, but Brené Brown considers herself to be the self-appointed president of the Ted Lasso fan club. And this was a fantastic episode. So Ted Lasso is this goofy, very nice character. So it's a typical workplace comedy where it's an American football coach who has now come to England to coach a Premier League side. The main character, Ted Lasso, is just a very nice guy. The fans are calling him all kinds of names and he just responds with a smile and is always doing the right thing. So this episode was very interesting because she talked about how this guy is able to connect with so many different people by being who he is. So that was very nice. So this is like the third recommendation of it. So one was Vinita Gera's Brené Brown and the Ted Lasso show. So I actually started watching the show and binge watched it in one night. I finished off the first season. And one of the most interesting takeaways from that episode was Sudeikis and Brendan Hunt. I think Brendan Hunt was also, he lived some part of his life in the Netherlands. So there's this word called Hesselik, which is spelled Gezelig, which is like the hygge or Susegard of Goa. This is like that which encompasses the Dutch culture, which basically means snug and cozy. So this whole character is supposed to be very snug and cozy. So I think that was one more takeaway for me from that episode.
Yeah, so we got a podcast episode, show recommendation, and a word of the month. I think
yes,
maybe new categories we should be introducing on Incite Your Month. All right, with that, let's go to our final section, which is one habit tip from us at Choose To Thinq. Harish, whenever we start an upleveling journey or we help someone think about upleveling, there is always this role of reflection, looking back, what have you been doing, setting up that baseline, and then just using that every day to see have we moved forward or not. And it actually struck me because I think last week we were talking about the book written by Annie Duke on poker, and there was this mention of decision journal. And we've known the importance of journaling for food, for exercise, for gratitude, and so much. We thought that we should just call this out, that creating a daily reflection habit is such an important kind of part of any upleveling journey. And I knew you have been very successful at journaling. So what we thought was we'll tell people that the best way, or the simplest way to start with a journaling habit is one, pick a slot and give yourself an alarm that tells you it's time for that journaling habit. Maybe have a dedicated notebook. Maybe you should do it old style notebook because it doesn't have pop-ups and notifications and tempting tabs in it to get distracted. And what I also did was start very simple. Start with a small set of questions. Maybe 3 questions we can recommend is one thing you did well today, one thing you could have done better, and one thing you're grateful for. It covers a range of topics, and then you can keep adding more questions over time. So any journaling tips for our listeners before we close?
Yeah, so in fact, I have 2 different journaling practices that I have. One is the Q&A book that you had gifted me. So that is something which I do in the morning, which is more about the past. There's no specific kind of question there. There are different questions that pop up. And the other one is where I wrap up my day. So in fact, yesterday was very interesting because I usually do it on my phone in my notes. And yesterday I was trying to get my phone OS updated. So my notes was not going to work. So I actually took my laptop.
Notebooks, they don't have to be rebooted.
Yes, which is what I was thinking about when you mentioned start with a regular physical book. Because then I had to take my laptop to my bed and I actually made my notes on the laptop. So yes, that's a danger if you're doing it using an electronic means. But yeah, start with whatever works for you. Notes work for me. If it's a notebook, the physical nature of it also has a very different feel. So if that works, go ahead. But do spend that time, 10 minutes, 5 minutes, just to think about how your day went and how you want to plan the next day.
Yeah, so then I'm sure we'll do more on these habit tips and journaling, but this is a good time to also point to the Pause at Yellow ebook that we at Choose To Thinq have put together over many years, a collection of several, about 100 questions that can uplevel various aspects of your life. So with that recommendation, we'll call this episode to a close. Thanks, Harish. We'll see our viewers next month.
Thanks, Ramanand.